right, so we're starting now. Welcome everyone to our webinar titled Rethinking Justice, the Impact of Mass Incarceration on Women Worldwide. I am Lindsay Laguna, and I'm a board member of the Harvard Alumni for Global Women's Empowerment, or as we also call it, Harvard GlobalWE. So for those of you who are new to Harvard GlobalWE, we are a shared interest group of the Harvard Alumni Association. We are dedicated to the empowerment of women through education, dialogue, and connection among individuals working for women's rights and freedoms worldwide. Harvard GlobalWE does not advocate a specific ideology or political or cultural agenda. We are an inclusive organization with membership open to and comprising all genders. We are excited that you can join us today, but first we would like to cover some logistics before moving forward. The whole webinar will last 1 hour, so we appreciate your cooperation in taking the following action steps to make it run more smoothly. So one, keep the microphones on your devices on mute unless you are the person speaking. Two, GlobalWE board member Tara is the technology contact today. So if you have issues with technology, please contact her at her email. So it's tara.abrahams@gmail.com. That is spelled tara.abrahams@gmail.com. We are trying a relatively new platform and would appreciate your patience and feedback as we work through the session today. So, and also three, if you have questions for the panelists later in today's discussion, you may email those questions to Tara as well. If we have time toward the end of the webinar, the panelists will answer your questions. So now that we have established some logistics, we can continue with today's agenda. During this webinar, a set of distinguished panelists from the worlds of law, international relations, public policy and advocacy, and academia will discuss the circumstances giving rise to the increase in women's detention and incarceration rates and the challenges faced by women when they return home from jail or prison and attempt to reintegrate into society. So today we are privileged to have the following guests on our panel. First, we have Tahiba Bain, founder of Women Against Mass Incarceration, an organization empowering justice-involved women and girls. She is also the director of Coalition for the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls. Next, we have Candice Krutchnet, a professor from the University of Toronto Department of Sociology. Her research has focused on women offenders, the victimization of women and female inmates. Third, we have Liz Fuvola, a program manager with the Center on Sentencing and Corrections at the Vera Institute of Justice. She provides technical assistance and training to counties seeking to implement data-driven criminal justice reforms. And last but not least, we have Coletta Youngers, a senior fellow from the Washington Office on Latin America, or sometimes we'll say WOLA, and a senior associate for the International Drug Policy Consortium. She is the lead coordinator of a project on women, drug policy and incarceration in Latin America, and assists the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls with their international outreach. On behalf of GlobalWE, I would like to say thank you to all of the panelists for investing time to be here today. So we're now going to transition to our panel discussion. So I will start asking our panelists questions. And again, listeners, if you were just joining us, you are also welcome to send your questions to the email of our GlobalWE board member, Tara, whose email is tara.abrahams@gmail.com. If we have time, we will cover them in our conversation toward the end. So let's begin with the first question, where I just ask more about the background of all our panelists. Earlier, I shared briefly their job titles and descriptions. Together, they bring these rich and diverse perspectives on this topic. Now, this is a question for all of you. Could each of you share more about your work on the mass incarceration and detention of women? We could just start with, Tahiba, then we'll go to Candice, Liz, and Coletta. All right? And then also just make sure to unmute your microphone when it's your turn to speak.
Hello, thank you for having me. It's great to be here. The work that I do on locally is to actually advocate and offer emotional support towards women that's reentering into society. On the National Council, we do the same thing on a larger level, and we also uplift the people that's doing the work on the ground in their prospective communities to help them reach the women that's coming home from prison, that's all as well that are in prison. Um, Together, we're looking to build a great resource for women coming home because there aren't too many resources, and we also advocate for them, and because we are part of the problem and part of the solution at the same time. So what we do is we create legislation, and we offer testimony, public testimony, and we empower the women to do the same and let them know that you have a voice and you need to be heard, and people are willing to listen if you are willing to speak.
Thank you. And then can we also now go to Candace? And you can make sure that your microphone is turned on, Candace, so that we can hear you. Or you could unmute it. Candace, can you hear me? Oh, it looks like your microphone is unmuted. Can you hear me, Candace?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Oh yeah, now we can hear you. Lovely.
Sorry.
No problem.
So, I started a project with Rosemary Gartner during the height of the mass incarceration movement. The most dramatic increases for women in incarceration took place between 1980 and 2000. And in the middle of the 1990s, we started a project in 2 prisons in California Institution for Women and Valley State Prison, to look at changes over time and across institutions in the conditions of confinement women experience. I then had a period at Cambridge University and replicated that study on 3 women's prisons in England. And then most recently and finally, I've done work in the women's prisons in the Netherlands. So that's my background in it.
Thank you. And now we can move on to Liz. Liz, you could unmute your microphone. Oh, Liz.
Oh, there we go.
I can hear you now. Lovely.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. This is Liz Swavola from the Vera Institute of Justice. Thank you so much for being here and for all of us for discussing this important topic. So here at Vera, we work with governments and communities across the country to improve the systems that people should be able to rely on for safety and justice. And part of the work that we do is looking at data and trying to understand trends and changes in incarceration over time. And one of our key areas of focus is what we call closing incarceration's front door. That means ending incarceration at the local level, so city and county jails. City and county jails primarily hold people who are pre-trial, so they haven't yet gone to trial, they haven't been convicted, they're just waiting for their cases to be resolved. And in wanting to focus on city and county jails, we started to look at all of the data that these jails had submitted to the federal government since 1970. And one thing that really shocked us was the growth of the number of women in local jails. It had grown 14 times, or 1,200%. And so we set out to try to understand that growth in a report called Overlooked: Women in Jails in an Era of Reform. And what we found is that there's been very little attention paid to women in local jails, women's incarceration generally, but especially at the local level. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that as we progress. Thank you.
Thank you. And last we'll hear from Coletta.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for including me in this terrific panel. I actually got involved in this work about 10 years ago. I come from a human rights background, working on human rights issues in Latin America, and I was part of a research project looking at the impact of drug laws on prison overcrowding in Latin America. And as the data started coming in, like Liz, I was just astounded at the growing rate of women's incarceration in the region. While clearly there are more men than women incarcerated, the rate of women's incarceration is growing at an alarming rate. And so that prompted us to begin working on the issue, and and we organized a working group on the issue of women, drug policy, and incarceration that's composed of an interesting combination of women from the human rights field for work on drug policy issues and from feminist organizations, and we've done a series of activities together around international, regional, and national level advocacy, and more recently have really been working to try and create spaces for formerly incarcerated women in Latin America to come together, because they really should be the ones driving the policy alternatives.
Thank you. So now that everyone has a better idea of the backgrounds you're all coming from and the work that you've done with respect to mass incarceration and detention of women, I'm just going to ask that you all share what in your opinion are the most significant factors that have led to mass incarceration and detention of women, and then we could go again in the order of Tahiba, then Candace, Liz, and then Coletta. So Tahiba, we'll start with you.
Can you repeat that, please? I'm sorry.
Oh, no problem. So with the next question, now that we have a better idea of everyone's background and work with this, what in your opinion are the most significant factors that have led to the mass incarceration and detention of women?
Okay, I do apologize. Thank you. Significant factors is number one, poverty, right? And people are being criminalized for being poor. The systematic oppression that is in place from, I believe, the young lady said from 1980 until 2000, it was an influx of women that entered into the prison system, and that was due to the war on drugs and war on crime, and it was actually the war on being poor. And it reached over a 700% projectile from like within the last 20, 30 years. And we have sex trafficking today that's more prevalent than it ever has been in America, or at least we're becoming more knowledgeable of it. And we have domestic violence. Women are going to prison for protecting themselves. They have been in abusive relationships for many years, and then they decide that, you know what, the police isn't helping, no, the system isn't helping, but they know that if this continues, either one or two things are going to happen. The perpetrator is going to kill them and their children, or just them and then left. So, not to kill anyone, but to protect themselves. And they go to prison for protecting their families. And then if a man call and say, if he started the domestic violence or interpersonal relationship violence, and he calls the police first, that's another thing in the law. I don't know if people are aware of that whoever calls the police first is the person that does not normally get arrested. So yeah, so men have taken that and say, well, I'm going to call the police, because they know the woman is going to call the police. So instead of them just arresting or just separating the both of them, if the man called, the woman goes to prison or to jail. And another thing is truancy of children. I come to realize that people are actually, being punished for what their children's behavior, right? Kamala Harris put that into place a few years ago, saying that, if these single parents can't control their children and children being truant, then they go to prison for what their children are doing. So these are all factors that play in a part of women entering into the prison system on a much faster rate and a larger scale, right? And we have homeless problems. Like a lot of people coming home from prison are homeless, women and men coming home from prison, they're homeless and they sleeping on the street. So they have these broken window laws that constantly revolve them in the system, because they have no place to go. They can't get a job. They can't do this. They can't do that. And then they're in the street. And because they're in the street and they're considered vagrants, they have the vagrancy laws that constantly brings them back into prison. So into the jail system. So it's a lot that plays a part in the factors of women entering into the prison system at a much larger and higher rate.
I mean, yeah, thank you for sharing those insights. Like, not just about like sometimes we're like what their place is in their relationship or their family and how that might then impact them. And then also, again, like what you're mentioning with homeless and poverty, about the place where they are in their community and how that makes them more likely. And then so next, can we move on to Candace and you can share some of your perspectives on these factors. So, oh, Candace, so we can't hear you. Perhaps you could just turn the microphone on now.
Hello?
Oh, yes, we can hear you now. Great.
Good. All right. Okay, I agree with Theba that the war on drugs was a part of this. There is no question that traditionally violent crime and property crimes were the offenses for which women were sent to prison, and only 12% prior to the 1980s of women were involved in drug offenses. That changed radically. And the other factor, though, that I think is important beside the war on drugs is the change from indeterminate sentencing to determinate sentencing. Under indeterminate sentencing, the judge could look at a woman's case, her file, and have some discretion in how he handled it. He could take into account her role in the offense, her family responsibilities, those kinds of things. But once determinate sentencing was put in place, the judge was almost removed from the picture, and the prosecutor became central to what happened to women. And it became an offense-based and prior record-based decision, not taking the whole context of women's lives into account. In addition, layering on that determinate sentencing was mandatory minimums for certain offenses and truth in sentencing. So women's sentences, they just started piling up in prison. There was no valve to let them out. You just had to serve your time. So the bodies kept piling up inside of prison.
Thank you for sharing that. And then let's next go to Liz.
Yeah, so I think my fellow panelists really captured it really beautifully. So not a lot to add, but speaking specifically about local, county and city jails, this is really the question that we set out to answer in our report Overlooked. And what we found is that the federal government has done a terrible job of tracking why women are increasingly going to jail. So just as an example of that, the last time they reported on the charges that are bringing women to jail was 2002. So in our report, we really had to rely on some old and outdated data. What we did find is that most women, the vast majority, were in jail for lower level charges, things like property crimes, drug charges, public order charges, which can be things like disorderly conduct or loitering, really charges you have to question whether they have anything to do with public safety at all. And so what we took away from this is that women were really being criminalized for their efforts to survive. Tahiba touched on this. Were prior to incarceration, we're dealing with things like poverty, significant trauma. 90% of women in jails report having experienced sexual violence. 1/3 have significant mental illness. And so as criminal justice system has come to focus on lower level charges like drug and property offenses, women have been swept into the system. And many of the communities where we're seeing the most growth are actually rural and small communities that don't have the resources to address the challenges that women are facing. So instead, their jail becomes the service provider by default.
Thanks for sharing. And yes, it just seems to be that there's this ongoing theme of survival, defending yourself, protecting, and then also, like you were mentioning, these lower level offenses. So thank you for bringing that. And then also lastly, just Coletta, just for bringing in that the perspective from Latin America.
The situation in Latin America is quite similar, although I would say that the punitive drug laws and excessive sentences are clearly the driving force behind women's incarceration. We're locking up more and more women for low-level drug offenses for very long periods of time. So if you look at men in any given country in Latin America, maybe 20 or 25% are incarcerated for drug offenses of the overall male prison population. For women, that number tends to be between 40 and up to 80% of women in prison are there for drug offenses. And who are these women? As others have said, they are almost all extremely poor. They come from very, very precarious situations, low levels of education, lack of employment opportunities, and the vast, vast majority are mothers and single mothers. We find some prisons in Latin America where over 90% of women in prison are single moms. So what does that tell us? These women are getting engaged in this case, in the drug trade. They may be selling small amounts of drugs, transporting drugs, smuggling drugs into prison, which is the offenses that women tend to commit within the drug trade. And they're doing that to put food on the table for their kids. So what we're essentially seeing is the criminalization of poverty. And just as a final note, I think it's really important to remember that these women are engaged in high-risk activities for very low remuneration. And they are the ones that the police go after to meet arrest quotas. So they are picked up, put in prison. They're caught in flagrante, so they almost always end up with a long plea bargain sentence because, of course, they have no information to exchange with the authorities regarding the upper echelons of the criminal network. And then that makes absolutely no dent in the drug trade or on citizen security, because the next day somebody else is out there and has taken their place. So it really is a situation that demands dramatic reforms.
Yes, I mean, yeah, so thank you for bringing that up, just how, it's not just survival for themselves, but also just food on the table for their families. And then also, so now that we're all getting a broader perspective of just what types of factors and conditions people have been living in that may have contributed to why there is now this mass detention and mass incarceration of women, we'd like to shift the conversation to talking about, well, I guess the next question, it's two-part. One, what are the experiences and living conditions like for women being incarcerated or detained? And then also, I guess this will come out in your answers, just how are the experiences of women in the US similar or different from women in other countries? And so for this question, we can start with Tahiba, then go to Coletta, and then Candace. All right. So
Hi.
All
Okay,
right.
so the living conditions are horrific. It's nothing cute, fancy, or pretty about the living conditions in any prison, anywhere around the world. The lack of emotional support that we go through, because women are emotional beings, and especially women that have children and have been taken away from their children and just removed. So with that, we go through a psychological shift within our own self about our children being left and our families being left, and sometimes the only recourse that they offer us is psychotropical meds that put you in a state of zombiness, and you're walking around not feeling anything and not really aware or present in the moment of where you're at. And for a lot of women have taken on that relief, because sometimes that's the only relief. And if they don't do that, I have been around where people committed suicide or attempted to commit suicide because they weren't able to adapt to the environment in which they were put in from this by their sentence and from the crime. And they were coming in younger and younger. So with that being said, next thing you have them coming in expecting something else, and expecting one thing and getting something else, and then they couldn't adapt. They couldn't find a place to fit in. So the next thing they were being rushed out from taking an overdose of those psychotropical meds and or committing suicide. So that's the living conditions of imprisonment. The support, we don't really get support. Sometimes the family members, you would think that we have family members to support us on a larger scale, but we don't. The men get more support than the women do. When you go into the visiting room, you can it's half empty sometimes, because we are the women, and we the women that usually go and support the man. But there's nobody really coming to support us unless it's our grandmother, our mothers, our children, and they can't. And then they put us in prisons so far away from our homes that it makes it almost impossible to come and visit on a constant basis. So you may see them once every 2 months or something of that nature. Inside the prison, we have certain issues men don't have, right? So we don't get adequate hygiene products within that space of that time and when we need it. And the guards are so rude at those moments when we have those issues and have that time that we need those hygiene products. They say to us, oh, well, use something that's not appropriate. So these are the things that we go through that people don't talk about and people don't know about, and they think that we're getting we're living in some type of luxury because we're constantly coming back and forth in prison. But it's not a luxury. It's just that after the prison sentence, the resources that are like, there aren't any too many resources for women coming home from prison. So that's what the recidivism rate, that's why the recidivism rate is always so high. It goes up and down, but it's usually on a higher level because there's lack of a lot of resources and support.
All right. Well, and could we, and also, I guess now, Coletta, I guess, would you like to share your perspectives on this in comparison with the US? Yep.
Sure. I think there are a lot of similarities, but I'll highlight some of the differences. I think, at least in my experience, obviously have a lot more experience visiting prisons, women's prisons in Latin America than in the US. But my impression overall is that prison conditions are much worse in Latin America. They tend to be, depending on where you are, very inadequate structures. Often there are water shortages. There was recently a situation in the women's prison in Bogota, Colombia, where the prison cafeteria was shut down because health conditions were so bad, and women literally had almost nothing to eat for about 5 days before they finally got some renewed service going. Food is inedible. There's no public, no health or other kinds of psychological support services practically at all. And as Tahiba mentioned, in terms of training programs, those do tend to be much more oriented for men. And for women, what you find is they teach them how to sew or how to knit, not skills that are going to allow them to develop any kind of employment opportunities once they are released from prison. Having said that, I also have the impression that in most women's prisons in Latin America, the regimen or it's much less strict than it is in women's prisons. So often it's just, there'll be an open patio, women can mill about freely. There's a lot of opportunity for exchange between women. So you really do get a sense of solidarity, which is not to say you don't have that in US prisons. I clearly see that talking to folks like Tahiba here, but the situation allows them to develop cooperative ways of coping, of cooking meals together, of cleaning, that sort of thing. Now, what's changing is the introduction of US-style maximum security prisons. And as those are increasingly being built in Latin America, those solidarity networks are broken down. I'll give you just one example. There's a prison in Ecuador, Quito, Ecuador. I visited the original women's prison, El Inca. It was very much along the lines that I just described. They built a maximum security prison for women. Didn't matter what the charge was. Everybody goes to the maximum security prison. It's 3 hours outside of Quito, which means that, of course, it's very hard for women's families to visit them. They now have individual cells where they are kept most of the day, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a serious problem. And then and of course, that goes hand in hand with of prisons, which is a growing problem in Latin America. And I'll just conclude by also noting another issue, which is that in many Latin American countries, women are allowed to have their children in prison with them. This is an issue of much debate, and it varies by country. But I think it's important to remember that women with children, when you go to prison, your biggest drama is what to do with your kids. Often your family has rejected you. They won't take the kids. They may end up with a distant relative in an abusive situation, in a totally inadequate state institution, and often on the street. So for women who are able to bring their kids into prison, they will often do that. Usually it's for a period of time, often up to 3 or 4 years. And of course, that's a dilemma. For the woman, the child is close. You can create that mother-child bond. But of course, there's concerns about having a child grow up in that situation. And just to conclude, what happens then when the child reaches the age where they can no longer stay in the prison, there's absolutely no support services given to prepare either the mother or the child for that separation. So for the mother, from one day to the next, they lose the reason, the child that has allowed them to cope with prison. And then for the child, they go out into the world that they don't know with absolutely no support. So that is a real issue in Latin America.
Thank you. And then next we will go to Candace.
Okay, hi.
We can hear you now.
Thanks. I agree with a lot of what Coletta said. I think that the lack of training for viable employment opportunities is universal in women's prisons. But I think to kind of set the context here, it's important to know that worldwide, women represent anywhere between 2 and 9% of the prison populations in their respective countries. What this means is that any dollars that are allocated to corrections in any country, the leftovers are going to women. The bulk of the money is going to male institutions and male offenders. So you really have these sad sack institutions for women that are trying to skimp by on the leftovers from men. I think there are a couple of things that there are variations across countries that are important to note. I think a defining feature of women's experiences in incarceration in California is overcrowding. That is, I mean, at Valley State Prison, they had 8 women to a cell, 4 bunk beds. It was quite terrible for the women. It's very different in England. They often use older houses and they roll them over to be houses of confinement for women. But they have less emphasis on getting women out of their cells. So the women will spend long, long periods of time single-celled, and self-harm and suicide ideation as a result is very, very high in England. Healthcare is another issue, again, because women are left out of the dollar equation in corrections. The healthcare tends to be pretty terrible for women. And I know there have been several suits, both in a number of states, where people have filed against the Department of Corrections because they've got extreme illnesses, cancer, and nothing is being done for them. Finally, I think it's also important to note that although the Netherlands has some of these problems, it's probably the best example I ever saw of trying to make it work for women in prison. In the sense that many, like other countries, many of the women there they were drug mules. They were caught at Schiphol Airport, right, transporting drugs in. But the correctional officers made a concerted effort to try to hook women up in their country of origin via Skype or FaceTime so that they could see their kids. I found that incredibly unusual. So I think there are some notable variations, but generally speaking, women's conditions of confinement reflect the fact that the money just isn't there, nor is there an interest in taking care of this small population.
Yes, what's really coming through in the different answers from all of you is just that, you know, these women, you know, in the different countries, they were already in these vulnerable situations, lack of resources. They were doing things to survive, not just for themselves, but also their families. Then they become incarcerated, and then the system is designed more for men, you know, and then, you know, whether it's the training programs not necessarily being designed for them in the most ample way for the future, or even just, you know, who comes to visit them. And like, you know, if like maybe with men, like the women get to visit, but it doesn't necessarily work that same way. I'm seeing that on the side in the chats that Tahiba, you wanted to share more insights. I guess, you know, I know that you've typed some of it here, but if you just want to share verbally, because I know this is being recorded, if you just want to share verbally for audiences, some of what you're writing here, we can do that as well.
Oh, okay. I was just saying how when Coletta was talking about the programming, as well as Candace, it's like she said, it's universal, because the programming for women in America is just as lax as it is in Latin America and in the Netherlands, where we are not taught, you know, skills that can help us translate into working experience, right? But the only way we can do that is if we're working in a prison industrial complex within the prison system, where I know when we was in a federal prison, we worked for Unicor. In Unicor, I was actually a 411 operator. Like when people called 411 and they needed information, they were actually getting me sitting in a prison, right? I was actually we built parts for the U.S. government, right? The Navy, the Army, and stuff like that. We built those parts. We built cables, and we're not recognized for that, and we're getting like little to no money. But those are the skills that we can get, like on the job training skills that could translate to employment, viable employment. However, it's hard for women to get into those fields, especially when you're building transmitters and you're in a machine shop. Men don't want you in that machine shop, so it's hard, and you got to prove yourself, and you got to work double extra hard to do it. And when you come out of prison, no, SNET and AT&T, they're not hiring you as a 411 operator because you're formerly incarcerated. So even though we can do the work while we're in prison and we're getting the skills and the training that, that is sufficient for us in prison, it's not being translated to when you're coming home for viable employment.
Yeah, no, and actually you're already transitioning into what some of my upcoming questions were. So aside from what you have mentioned, no, this is great. Just you're talking about the opportunities that exist in theory, or and what the actual reality looks like. Are there other things that you would want to add in addition to what you've said?
Well, yeah, because a lot of people, we have a false dichotomous narrative going on, where it says, people are separating into violent, nonviolent from violent, right? And when you do that, you're separating the movement, you're separating the reform, because everyone deserves another chance, right? I'm not even going to say a second chance, but another chance. Whether it's a nonviolent or a violent offense, a person that has the skills, the opportunity, and have proven to show rehabilitative, a model of rehabilitation outside of prison, should be given another opportunity to live life and have basic human needs to live. Right? I'm a woman that have a violent conviction, and it's hard for me to actually navigate within a society that look at me as a person that doesn't deserve. But when a person that's have a nonviolent offense come and sit right next to me to fill out the same application for the same job, and I'm more qualified than they are, but they get the opportunity because their offense seems to be more transferable skills into what they can believe they can do the job. I get left behind. And that's not fair because I have children, I have a life, and I don't think that one act of brain fog and of lack of judgment should continue to dictate the rest of my life, be it nonviolent or violent.
Mhm. Yeah, it's also like, yeah, this whole topic of also solidarity is coming up. And so when you're right, like just when you're separating these two things, what that does in terms of opportunities, because again, it sounds like a lot of what's bringing women into into incarceration and detention is that they were trying to better themselves, better better the lives of their family. And then now coming out, it's like they have even fewer opportunities or resources based on their offense.
Exactly.
Yeah, and then I also, just with this question of like the resources, the challenges, I also want to just get the perspective from Cleta for Latin America.
So with regards to women coming out of prison in Latin America, I think in many ways it's even harder than in the United States, which is not to say that it's not tremendously hard in the United States as well. I think that there is even more stigma and discrimination in Latin American countries for women who have gone to prison, particularly for drug offenses. They are seen as having defied the traditional roles assigned to them by society as caregivers. You even hear judges making allusions to that in their sentencing, that women are threatening their children by engaging in these activities, failing to take into account the real reasons that women are engaging in these activities. As I noted before, women are often abandoned by their families. So when they come out, they often don't have a place to go. And of course, as is the case around the world, you come out and you have a criminal record. So if you were in a situation of poverty before, your poverty is greatly exacerbated upon coming out of prison. And there are very few programs that will actually help women when they come out of prison to find housing, reconnect with their kids, find employment, that sort of thing. The two notable exceptions in Latin America are Uruguay and Costa Rica. Ironically, two very small countries, but they with limited resources, but both of those countries have put into place really interesting programs to try and help these women. Just to give one example, Costa Rica has set up what's called the Interinstitutional Network, which is basically designed to be a one-stop shop for, they begin working with women before they come out of prison, and then once they're out, you can go to one place and talk to the agency that deals with helping to find housing, and in the same place talk to somebody who can help with an employment. And so it's designed to facilitate and make it much easier for women who are coming out, rather than having to go around to a gazillion different agencies and a bureaucracy that you don't understand. And that program has been successful in helping a small number of women reintegrate once they come out.
Thank you. Yeah, what I'm really just getting from all of you as panelists is just, I feel like this has been like, okay, these are this, we're hearing about the dire situations they had before incarceration and detention. And then they're in even more dire circumstances once they are in jail or in prison. But we are also hearing some examples of, like, the Netherlands, Uruguay, Costa Rica, how there are some glimmers of hope for change. And so, we also, especially with all the listeners who are hearing about these different circumstances, I'd like to shift the conversation to just what types of policies have been proposed and implemented to address issues related to mass incarceration and detention, especially among women. And then also furthermore, what actions can our listeners take in addressing these issues? So we can start, actually, let's go Candace, Liz, Coletta, and then Tahiba. So Candace?
Yeah, that's a really hard question. I think because the challenges are so numerous. I mean, 25 states in the United States adopted the Safe Families Act, which really restricted women's ability to reunite with their children. If it had been like 24 months and they'd had no contact, they can lose custody of their children. So in addition to housing limitations in the US, right, where there are some places where you cannot, if you're a convicted felon, can't get a house, can't vote, can't, on and on. The challenges are tremendous. But I think given the number of women who are incarcerated with substance abuse problems, one of the biggest factors that could make a difference is the actual implementation of treatment programs for substance abuse. They're available in some prisons, but they're severely limited in terms of how many women can get into them. So they're not adequately staffed in a number of cases, and I think they're absolutely crucial, because if women don't get that treatment, no matter if you give them a house or you give them a job, if they still have a substance abuse problem, it's going nowhere. So I think the policies really have to think about what women need, which is usable employment skills so they can support themselves, as well as dealing with any substance abuse problems they have.
So yeah, the combination of the health, the holistic health. Like not just the occupation. I know that's the training is something that comes up a lot, but also just where are you mentally, health-wise, substance abuse, because you're right, that's core before we even get to the professional opportunities for them afterward. And then let's see, next, could we go to Liz?
Sure. Yeah, so one thing that gives me some hope is that with recent reform efforts on the front end of the criminal justice system, we've seen the number of people coming into jail decline. So we know that these efforts are working. Unfortunately, they have not reached women at all. So we've seen the number of men admitted to jail decrease by about 25%, whereas women have stayed completely static. About 2.5 million women each year are admitted to jail. So if we could take those efforts and focus them specifically on women, I think we would start to see that trend change. And I think Candace is right. Substance use treatment is so deeply needed. Treatment for trauma, efforts to help women move out of poverty. As Coletta mentioned earlier, most women in jail are also mothers, about 80%, and many of them are single mothers. So supporting families, making every effort to keep them unified rather than, as Candace touched on, tearing families apart. And I think we're in a really critical moment because a lot of communities are starting to consider jail construction. So a lot of jails were built in the 70s and 80s when there were very few women in jail. And now women are being, shipped out to other counties. They are being held in juvenile facilities that might have no resources for women at all. And so I think what listeners can do is really pay attention to what's happening in their communities. Pay attention to elections like judges and district attorneys. I know those may not seem important in the grand scheme of things, but to communities, they are critical. Make sure that you're holding your elected officials accountable, that they're thinking about women, that women are not an afterthought, that prosecutors have diversion programs that are available to women, that low-level charges are being decriminalized, and that we're not wasting communities' valuable resources on criminalizing poverty and substance use. So I would really encourage folks to see what's going on at their county or city level.
Great. So whether or not you live somewhere that has been represented in this conversation, just start with where you are, because a lot of these lessons, as we have seen, are applicable globally. And then next, Coletta.
So Liz, I'm so struck by that statistic you just gave about declining numbers of men in going into jails in contrast to women. It's sort of the opposite in Latin America. I feel like it's been much easier. Well, we haven't had reforms along the lines that you've had here, but it's been much easier to open up a debate about women in prison. It's much easier when you're talking to policymakers about women with kids who are incarcerated and why they shouldn't be there than the broader populations within prison, which is not to say that in a way we have used that as a way to open up a door to these much broader discussions. And I think one thing that our coalition work has been very effective at is getting the issue of women incarceration on the map in Latin America. Nobody was talking about this 6 or 7 years ago. Now, most governments give lip service to at least having some concerns about the issue of women who are in prison. And we've been able to do some things at the international within the United Nations as well. There's now a resolution mandating gender mainstreaming into drug policies across the world. Not that governments will necessarily abide by that, but they have all agreed to it. So I think that's a different context. There have been some interesting reforms. There is much more of a focus on alternatives to incarceration, which are often allowed in law, but not put into practice. For example, house arrest, where it is used, it tends to be so restrictive that women are not able to fulfill their duties as mothers, as caregivers, or to have any kind of meaningful employment. So we've been working to try and convince judges and prosecutors that they need to approach this in a very different way, judges in particular in this case, and use it as a meaningful alternative to incarceration. There have been some interesting examples of pardons that governments have given to prison populations. Won't go into details for lack of time, but there have been in Ecuador and Bolivia, several thousand women have gotten out of prison through that process. And we're in the midst of a campaign in Mexico to secure a pardon for women incarcerated for drug offenses. We won't get all of that, but I think we will be successful in getting a significant portion of those women out of prison. But of course, those are stopgap measures. We need to fundamentally reform drug laws. There are so many people, men and women, parents and people who are not parents, who are going to prison who simply shouldn't be there. Nobody should go to prison to get their drug treatment. Drug users should not go to prison. People who commit low-level offenses should not go to prison. There should be other alternatives, be it job training, education, community service that allow them to live lives with dignity so that they don't have to resort to becoming involved in the drug trade to basically earn a living. So this is what I think. I mean, of course, it's true in this country, but it's true across the Americas that we need to fundamentally reform drug laws to dramatically reduce the number of people we are putting in cages, and to ensure that whatever sanction there is, that it's commensurate with the gravity of the alleged crime that has been committed.
Thank you. And then also just for sharing even how it might not seem like a lot, but even the lip service, like as you've mentioned, just even the fact that there's even more dialogue in itself has been progress, but of course there's still more work to do. So I know we have about 7 minutes left. I want to also make sure that Tahiba, you have time to respond to this. And then if we have additional time, we could at least maybe have one question from our listeners. So yeah, Tahiba, just your response on policies and what listeners can do. Hello?
Thank you. Yes, I'm here. I had to unmute myself.
All right.
Yeah, okay, I just want to backtrack real quick. When Coletta was talking about the women and the Latin America and the challenges, I also want to put out there, like, one of the challenges is from women that's in prison in America, that's getting deported back to these countries. They are left with virtually no resources, no support. Some of them may have been born in their country, but they don't know anything or don't have any connections, and they're just dropped off in that particular country. And that's something that we need to look at as well. We need to talk about, and that goes into the policy. So, and that's a policy we need to talk on, we need to tackle with the immigration and the concerns of that, because there's a lot that's go on with people that's being deported from America back into their respective countries, not even caring if they have any support or resources. So that's one of the policies that we definitely need to tackle. I agree with Candace where because we're addressing that now with the ASFA, Adoption Safe Family Act. That bill is very damaging to families' reunification, because it's 15 out of 22 months of you being absent. You could be in pretrial, haven't been convicted of anything, and they have a right to terminate your parental rights if they choose to. And it's the law that they can do it. So we're looking into repealing that at the ASFA bill, and we already implemented the primary caretakers bill, which is a law that says if you're the primary caretaker of your child, or of someone that is that's infirm, you have an option. They should offer you an alternative to incarceration option. We also enacted the Dignity Act, saying that women in prison should be treated with dignity treated with dignity and humanely. We also in that act came the anti-shackling, where people sometimes pull that out and made it its own bill. Anti-shackling bill, which is actually, I think that actually came before the Dignity Act, actually. And that one right there talks about how if a woman is pregnant in prison, they should not or could not or cannot be shackled, meaning hands tethered with a belly chain and attached to the leg irons during transportation of going to the medical, during transportation, and while giving birth and after giving birth, because that was happening where people were actually shackled to the bed while giving birth. We're working on incarceration, which is alternative to incarceration that is more damaging than helpful. And they have no accountability. They have no data statistics. It's at the discretion of either the DOC, the BOP, and or the Board of Pardon and Paroles, or whoever or the courts if they put it on them during pretrial. So there's no accountability with that. So we're looking into breaking into that area so they can show some type of transparency and accountability. Clemency, the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls, we are actually starting a national state clemency campaign where we're looking at women that are infirm, elderly, long-termers, and survived and punished that are eligible for clemency, and we're asking the governors and we're asking the Board of Pardon and Parole, depending on which state you're in, to utilize your clemency powers. And that's just to say a few. In Connecticut, we passed a bill this year, and it was signed by the governor earlier, in July, where the prosecution actually, You now have to you have to have transparency and accountability to the people, and you have to report on how you're making your decisions and why you're making your decisions, and the data have to be public knowledge. So we're working on bills that implement. So what I would want to say for the people that's listening that may want to get involved, get involved. Find out what it is that bothers you and that you want to help with, and just do it. Just do it, because this affects everyone. It's not just a person that's in prison or their family members. It affects your community and society at large.
Thank you. No, thank all of you so much for sharing all of those issues, how they intersect with all these issues that I know our listeners care about as well, whether it's, rights for women when they're pregnant, with their occupations, with mental health, with trauma, sexual violence, the list goes on and on. And then also, yes, thank you for bringing up the point about immigration, because so far, we've talked a little bit about it in each separate country, but also thinking about how, people move across borders and what our policies on different levels, international, national, local, how they all inform and impact each other. So also just seeing that we just have about a minute left, I just want to say
add one little teeny thing. What Thiba said. Are you there?
You talking to me? I'm sorry. Hi, Candace.
I just wanted to add one thing to what you said, which is when you said it affects everybody. I wrote an article maybe 10 years ago called The Paradox of Women's Imprisonment. And the paradox was that they represent this small portion of the prison population, but the effects of taking a woman out of the community, because she's often the network, the childcare, the glue that keeps it together, plus what happens to the next generation when mom is incarcerated as opposed to dad, is absolutely phenomenal. So the paradox is, it may seem like this small little problem, but the wave that ripples from putting her in prison is quite enormous.
Absolutely. Can you send me the link to that article, please?
Apologies. This is Tara Abrahams. I'm just jumping in. Oh, I think Lindsay is back. There she is.
I'm having trouble.
Sorry, Lindsay, we can't hear you. Is there any way you can try to? I can't hear you at least. I know she wanted to wrap up the call and thank all of the panelists so much for your incredible participation today.
Can't hear anything.
Sorry, Lindsay, we still can't hear you. I'm hoping that all of the panelists and attendees can hear me. Thank you again so much for your insights and your guidance on this incredibly important issue. Thanks to all of our participants from around the world, from GlobalWE. We did have, I know we are at a hard stop at 1 o'clock for those of you, especially who need to jump on a plane. With that said, we do have some questions that have come in. It would be great if we could share them with you perhaps over email, and we can circulate the answers to those questions in our follow-up, which will include a recording of this call. So thank you all very much. I think with that we'll close, and thank you so much for the important work that you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Get out of here.
Sahiba, I think you just click the red X if you see it on your screen.
Great.
No problem at all. No problem. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care.
All right. Yes,
Bye-bye.
Bye.